So, our next speaker to take the stage is born in Germany. She's Dutch-American, so with all those countries mixed in, it's no wonder that she has sort of taken an interest in remote working. Even made a career out of it under the brand name Collaborative Superpowers. She's also put it into actual practice. During many years, she worked managing bands on tour all over the world, working from a van. She's written a book, The Work Together Anywhere Handbook. She hosts podcasts, she facilitates workshops on hybrid working and better online meetings and stuff like that. She's a member of the EU-US expert group on the future of work, and she likes to make her own clothes. Please welcome Lisette Sutherland.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to set the timer so that I know how I'm going. And I always like to start at any Agile conference, I always like to say, I am not related to Jeff Sutherland. So we'll get that rumor out of the way. I'm also, if you're an 80s movies fan, I'm also not related to Kiefer or Donald Sutherland. I'm just Lisette, like Ken, right? I'm just Lisette. So today, what I wanted to do was give you some of my best tips for this new way of working that we found ourselves in post-pandemic. We're sort of in this in-between time. And you'll notice that I've got a link on the bottom for the Super Kit. This is if you want to download the Remote Working Success Kit that I've prepared. It has a lot of the resources that I'm talking about in today's talk. That link will be sort of scattered throughout the presentation, so you can always get back to that. And I have a few giveaways. So many of you know that I've got these virtual meeting cards, right? Like you're on mute. This is the most popular card. And I've also got one for, this one's Elmo. So you know in those meetings where there's always somebody who goes on and on and on, and you can't like verbally interrupt them. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's probably you. So Elmo is like a way to say like, enough, let's move on. So anyway, I've got these packs of cards. So if you say nice things about me on LinkedIn, or if you come and introduce yourselves, then I'll be happy to give out some cards. Yeah, exactly. All right. So many of you know I have been a strong remote work enthusiast for almost 2 decades now. But I have never tried to argue, is remote better than in-person, or is in-person better than remote? Because it totally depends, right? It is unique to every situation. But what I have always said is, regardless of how you work, you want to set up your systems and processes to be able to be remote in case something happens. And in the past, I would use examples like your kids are sick at home, or there's bad weather, or a transportation strike. I never would have used a global pandemic. It would have seemed totally dramatic. Nobody would have believed me. But here we are, 3 years later, 4 years later now, and you would think that we'd all be location independent by now. But no, the return to office mandates are rising. Leaders are saying that productivity is down, people are disappearing, and our company culture is suffering. And in fact, my best friend Abe was hired 100% remote at a company and is now given the return to office mandate. And this is in the company handbook, and they say, to have meaningful collaboration and promote creativity and spontaneity, we need to have people back at the office at least 1 day per week. Our objective is about effective collaboration, building connection, and harnessing those serendipitous interactions. So what we're seeing right now is when given the choice, about 50% of us want to be hybrid, and we want to go into the office about 2.5 days a week. That's sort of globally, that's what the data is showing. 30% of us want to be fully remote, and 20% of us want to go back to the Monday through Friday 9 to 5 schedule. So I'd like to see how this audience compares to the global numbers. So if you want to go back in person, fully, please stand up. All of our in-person people. All right. My husband is in this category. We have lots of interesting conversations at home. Who wants to be fully remote? Please stand up if you're on the fully remote. All right. And if you want to be hybrid, please. All right, so the majority. So in this case, the majority wants to be hybrid. Very few people want to go back 100% in person. And there's sort of, I would say, 20% of us that want to be remote. So it turns out that people don't mind going back to the office if there's a good reason to do so. And the number one deterrent for going back is the commute, right? We all hated the commute before the pandemic, and now it just seems insane. Right now, it's just totally insane. Now, the other reason that we don't want to go back is because our team members are not back at the office. So this is Abe in his office in Phoenix, Arizona, and it's just rows and rows and rows of empty desks. And he's complaining because he says, I'm sitting in an inferior workstation to what I have at home, and I'm on calls all day anyway because my team members are all over the world anyway, right? It doesn't make sense. And he is actively looking for a new job, right? So what we know is that the future of work is flexible. We simply can't go back to the way that it was before. The way that we are working has fundamentally changed. And also it shows that if everybody does something different, if we all are just totally flexible, chaos ensues, right? So the future of work is also deliberate, because what we know is that teams that collaborate intentionally are the ones that will have superpowers, whether you're in person or remote, but really when you're remote, it's critical. So if you have full flexibility right now on where you work, I'm hoping that in this talk, I will give you some tips for how to make it more sustainable and more fun. And if you're being mandated to go back to the office, I hope that these tips will help prepare you or help you create the inevitable flexibility that is coming your way, so that if you do go back to the office, that you don't go backwards in time. Now, speaking of going back in time, I want to start out our conversation by taking a tour of offices over time, and I want to start in the 1970s. So you'll see in the 1970s, the open office plan was very, very popular. And in fact, furniture tended to be modular so that you could move it around depending on the project that you were working on. And if you wanted to show people where you were, right, we'd have these calendars on the wall. If you went out to lunch, you'd actually move your little button to the lunch, or if you're taking vacations. We get to the 1980s, we get the punch cards, right? I punched in and out about that cafe a lot, and you get paid for exactly the minutes that you're working there. And in the 1980s, we start to see the cubicle come into play. And if you're really lucky, you got a cubicle with high walls, right? So that you had some semblance of privacy in these open offices. And just to prove that I was there, this is me when I worked in my former life as a hydrologist in an engineering firm in my cubicle. And what I remember about those days is that we actually had a secretary whose primary job it was to route calls coming into the company to the individual desks where they needed to be, right? Like that's what they did all day long. And if you wanted to get those really important messages out to people, right, you would print them out and you would put them in these interdepartmental mail envelopes and you would hand them to somebody, sign your name when you've read it, hand it to the next person. Does anybody still use these? Yeah, oh yeah, every talk I'm always surprised. There's always some hands that go, it's kind of crazy. And you'd put them in these cubbies if you didn't find anybody, right, the old mail rooms. You get to the year 2000 and the open office plan makes a comeback again. And in fact, to this day, about 80% of offices in the US are still open office plan. In 2010, the tech industries come onto the scene and our offices start to get hipper and more colorful as we're trying to attract the younger generations to come work for the Facebooks and the Twitters that are coming out. And then we get to 2020 and the great work from home experiment happens. This is my sister and my nephew. And what we learned is that the companies that had the remote first practices in place really made a seamless transition during the pandemic. And we also learned that working from home during a pandemic is not the same thing as remote working, right? So we're going from this old way of working where the office was the primary place that we went to get our work done. And now the mindset shift is going into this new way of working where we're flexible first and the office becomes one of many places that we go to get our work done. And in fact, when you look towards modern organizational design thinkers like my friend and mentor Jürgen, he says, if you want an organizational structure that can handle the challenges of the 21st century, then you need to ensure that there's practically no difference between a virtual team and a physical team. So what I'd like to do today is talk about how can we address those challenges that the leaders are saying that they're facing, right? How can we talk about productivity being down and people are disappearing and the company culture is suffering to take that head on? So let's start with productivity. It turns out productivity is very personal, right? What works for me is not going to work for you. And in general, there's two types of people. We've got the splitters and the blenders. The splitters are like, okay, I'm going to do my work between 9 and 5 or whatever your hours are. And then I'm going to leave work, and then life begins and play begins. The blenders are like, I'm going to work a little, do a little laundry. I'm going to work a little and go running. And I'm going to work a little and have a little lunch, right? And it tends to be about 50-50. So let's test this audience again. If you are a splitter, please stand up. I think it is again 50-50. All right, thank you. So I'm a blender myself, and I like to start my day with my neighbor cat who comes over for a little treat, and then we actually go for a walk together. He's like a dog cat, one of these Maine Coon dog cats. And then I go home and I do a few hours of work. In the afternoon, my husband and I, we go running or biking or swimming, whatever the training schedule says, and then I come back and I do a few more hours of work, and then at night I have the evenings to myself. So that's sort of my ideal day. But what I'd like to do now is ask you, what does your ideal day look like? Well, if you could design it perfectly, what would it be? So what I'd like to do, since we're at a conference and it's all about meeting and talking and networking with people, I'd like you to just turn to one or two of the people next to you and describe, only for 3 minutes, what your ideal day looks like. So I'll start the timer. I know people hate it, but I promise it'll be good. All right. I did this at another conference in October, but I used a different timer, and at the end it had this weird fire alarm sound. And so I was on stage like, is there a fire? And I was like, it was me. So I got a different one. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to play for you a video clip of an interview that I did with Rebecca Seal, who is the author of How to Work Alone and Not Lose Your Mind. And she gives some just good general tips about things that we've been discovering through the pandemic.
You have to figure out what are the things that pump up your work tire, not just the work that you do. In fact, that's almost the least important bit of it. But what's the stuff that scaffolds you, that sits around you? Like, are you getting enough access to daylight? Are you leaving your desk enough? Are you taking enough breaks? Are you being the worst boss of yourself you could possibly be? Are you saying, as the boss of your tiny company of one, and this is true even if you're a remote worker with an actual boss, when you work by yourself, you're the only one looking. Are you being really mean in a way that you wouldn't accept from a real human? Are you, for example, saying to yourself, you may only have a lunch break, which is 4 minutes long and consists of you eating some dry cheese directly from the fridge while doom scrolling on Twitter? Then you must return to your desk and expect yourself to do work. Like, is that, if you wouldn't accept that if somebody in real life said that to you, but are you doing that to yourself?
I could really relate to the dry cheese thing, sadly. So one of the things that's become extremely popular since the pandemic is people creating personal user manuals for themselves. One, as an introspective exercise to really understand what is it that I need in order to be productive, and what should others know about working with me? Right, so I've got my personal user manual as a page on my website, and I have things like my working hours, my ideal day, my communication preferences, some of my quirks, like I'm a really slow writer and I don't like talking on the phone, but I love video calls. Right, so all these things that other people should know about working with me. Now, I've got this picture of Depeche Mode here because, one, I'm a huge fan of Depeche Mode, and my father-in-law recently saw my personal user manual. It's in the signature of my email, and it turns out that he's a music fan too. Now, I've known this man for 15 years, and I had no idea that he was a music fan because he's also a football person, and I'm like a sewing person, so we didn't have a lot of overlapping topics. Now we are Depeche Mode buddies, right? So there's some team building aspect of personal user manuals also. We can get to know each other in a little bit of a wider way than just work related. My friend Dea has her personal user manual in Notion. She works with lots of different teams, so she uses it during the interview process so people can get to know her more quickly. She also uses it during the onboarding process for exactly the same reason. And she does all kinds of networking on LinkedIn using her own personal user manual. So what we saw with leaders saying, oh, productivity is an issue, what we saw during the pandemic was clear. Burnout was far more of a problem than laziness, right? We were working ourselves to death because it turns out if you can work from anywhere, we tend to work everywhere, all the time, all the places, right? So burnout was much more of a problem. And in fact, the Financial Times just came out with this data just this last month, a week ago, and they said that working from home is associated with higher productivity, about $20,000 per year for each extra remote day a week. That was just last week. So when leaders are saying that productivity is down, they might feel that, but the data does not show that to be true. So we'll take on the next issue of people disappearing, right? When we're working together in an office, we can see what people are doing because, well, we can see them. When we go remote or hybrid, we have to create transparency in new ways. One of those ways is by working out loud and just making our work visible to other people so that they know what we're doing. Part of group cohesion is understanding how we fit into the bigger picture. So the more that we can work out loud, the more visibility that we get on each other. People are also, the other reason, people respect you more when they know what you're doing, and they start to question your value when they don't know what you're doing. Right? So this whole idea of being visible is important. Now, we also need to recreate or redefine what presence means. Like, just because we're in the same room together, we're present, but what if we're not? How else can we be present? Tools to the rescue, of course. I'm a tool junkie, but I promise you I'll give you non-tool tips. But these virtual offices are being used by people just to create a little bit more presence, right? These are offices that you go to in your browser. Each of these individual boxes is a room. Each of these icons in the boxes is a separate person in the room. And you can only see and hear the people that are in the same room as you, but you can see where everybody else is on the virtual floor plan and just double-click into the next room if you want to be in that room with those people. So that's one way of doing it. I actually run free virtual co-working sessions almost every week, so that you're welcome to join. It's just random people from all over the world who get together for a 2-hour productivity power hour session where we just get work done together. And it's an interesting experience, so I invite you all to join us to see what it's like. This is a picture from 10 years ago with Jeff from Revolve Robotics experimenting with the Kubi telepresence device. So he's the only in-person person in this meeting, and everybody else is beaming in via telepresence robot. Then there's, of course, the drivable telepresence robots. And at the Suitable Technology Office, they have about 50% of the people in the flesh and 50% who beam in every day. It changes all kinds of office etiquettes, right? Like you can't shake hands anymore. So instead, when we're using robots, we fist bump. So you have a little bit more of a 2D approach. And then, of course, there's all kinds of virtual reality and augmented reality and these things that are happening. Meet in VR was some of my favorite meeting software. You put on your Oculus Quest, and within minutes, you're floating in a room above Earth with your colleagues in space. And then, of course, there's holograms. I've been saying for years, holograms are right around the corner. What I want to do is show you a quick 1-minute video from the CES conference in Las Vegas just in January this year. The sound quality is a little bit off, and it's, but I think it's only 1 minute, so you'll see what I mean.
Sabrina, nice to meet you.
Yes.
My name is Andre. I am one of the founders of Holoconnect. Next to you, Mark, the guy you spoke to is the other founder.
Where are you based out of?
I'm based in Amsterdam now.
So you're talking to me from Amsterdam? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So
it's a night shift for me.
I was gonna say late night for you. Okay, so cool. Are you standing in front of like a white background or?
Yeah, exactly. I'm standing in front of a white background, and in front of me is a camera, and behind that camera I have a monitor where I can see you.
Okay.
Filming me. You're looking lovely today, by the way, Sabrina.
So
and that's how we can interact.
So you could see me fine, even though there's no white background behind me.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
I cannot see you as a hologram, but I can see you through a monitor that is similar to a.
Got it.
Right, so that's now. So this technology is only going to get better and better. And of course, as the climate crisis grows, we're going to have to find new ways of being together without flying, halfway across the world for a one-day meeting. Right, so these kind of technologies, I think, are going to make a splash. But like I said before, it's the teams that collaborate intentionally will have superpowers. So it's not just about presence, it's all about intentionality. And one of the main ways of doing that is just by simply agreeing with your team on how you're going to work together, right? What is normal behavior for our team? My team uses this team canvas, and we started talking about our values because that sort of drives the decision-making behavior. We talked about what information are we going to share? Are there security protocols we need to think about? How are we going to communicate with each other, right? If the boss sends an email on the weekend, does that mean you have to answer it? Right? Or how do we know what each other are doing? And since the pandemic, we created a column for well-being. How do we work in a sustainable way so that we're not burning out? We then took all this information and we just put it into a document. So we have our team agreement together, and pretty much every week we review the team agreement just to see, is this way of working still working for us? I want to show you a quick video clip that I did with Darren Murph, who was the head of remote for GitLab, and he talks about how GitLab uses their handbook for company culture, but also they work in a handbook-first way. But I'll let Darren explain it.
But I want to dive into next the handbook, your central repository for how the company is run, and it's open to the public and it's very detailed. So it's not like there's a public version and a private version. There's one version. So why the transparency?
Yeah, this blew my mind when I was interviewing, and Handbook undersells it to some degree. What it really is the actual operating manual of the company. Most people think of Handbook and it's some flimsy PDF that gets revised gently and emailed around to the company once a year, and you have to take some quiz to say that you've read it. The GitLab Handbook, we don't expect everyone to read 13,000 pages of it during onboarding. We just teach you how to search it. So some people ask me, hey, is the handbook too big? And I say, well, is there too much information on the internet? Or did you just learn how to use Google? And that's a bit tongue in cheek, but we just teach people how to find what they need instead of trying to constrict the amount of information. It is public because transparency is one of our core values. GitLab has 6 core values. Together they spell credit. I would say Google the GitLab values page. It is a fascinating read. You'll find all 6 values as well as substantiating values, sub-values underneath. Transparency is a value because it makes us a better business. And when our handbook is public to the world, it reinforces our mission of everyone can contribute. A lot of the GitLab product has been influenced by the community. And if you aren't public with your product, how will the community know how to make it better? The same goes for our organizational design. We want our values to be public because we want others to look at it and help make it better if they so choose. A few years ago, we had someone who was a copywriter find our values page, and they actually made a merge request. This is a function within the GitLab program to update and edit some of the grammar on our values page to make it more readable. That is exactly the type of behavior that we want to instill. And the values page in particular is always evolving. In 2020 alone, we had almost 100 iterations to the company values page. And so I say the word values, but in practice, these are the actual tangible ways that we treat each other and the behaviors that we want to encourage across the team as well as outside of it.
So I like how he puts that. And just a fun fact about Darren is he is the Guinness Book of World Records holder for the most blog posts ever written. So I think that has something to do with the 13,000 pages of the handbook, but I digress. It doesn't have to be 13,000 pages. This is a Scrum team. They just use a simple Miro board to outline how they work together. This is all they need, and it sort of gets updated during every sprint. I also spoke with Allie Green. She's a digital nomad. Her team is in different places all the time. They're all digital nomads. So their agreement is that they meet every Monday to talk how they're going to collaborate for that week. That's their agreement. So there's no one right way. But what we do know is that we have to agree as a team on how to work together, because if everybody gets to just do whatever they want, as we've seen, chaos starts to ensue. But it's not just also about being intentional about how to work together. We also have to manage the information overload that tends to be happening. GitLab and Catalog came out with a survey a couple years ago that said, on average, the number of work applications sending us notifications at any given time is about 7 on average. And that most of us reply to these notifications outside of our own designated working hours. And we find it difficult to switch off because, well, most of us are thinking about work because we're getting those notifications all the time. And in fact, this back and forth communication is a signal for that we're online and working, right? It sort of forms a type of virtual office because people are responding to the messages. The problem is that we check our inboxes on average about once every 6 minutes, and our instant messaging applications about once per minute. And most of us need time for deep, focused, concentrated work. And this constant back and forth is causing, cognitive catastrophe, really. So at the end of the day, if you're tired, it's probably because of all the context switching back and forth. And in fact, there is a term for this. Cal Newport calls it the hyperactive hive mind. And it's a way of collaborating that's made possible by all these messaging systems, but it's not always a good way of collaborating. So he says, instead of trying to keep up, which is totally impossible anyway, right? The messages just keep coming. We've tried the flags and the filters and the priorities, right? They just keep coming. Instead, we have to change how the work flows in the organization. And so one of the good examples that I give of this is a team that I worked with. It was a small team with a lot of projects, and they just ended up creating a dashboard with all the projects, and that dashboard gets updated in real time. So you don't need to ask, what's the status, what's going on, right? There's no status meetings necessary. The dashboard shows everything. So for my next video, I think it's the last one, I want to show a quick conversation between Matt Mullenweg and Seth Godin about how WordPress eliminated email almost 15 years ago.
Oh yeah, so we actually eliminated email basically at the company like 14 years ago. So I get almost no internal emails. Yeah, I see lots of downsides of email. For example, like when someone leaves an organization, how much knowledge is lost in their inbox, which is kind of gone. All the collective decision-making conversations. And what truly needs to be private. So what we created essentially, building on WordPress, we built this thing called P2, which is an internal blogging system. You could almost think of it like an internal Twitter or Facebook or like a Yammer or one of these other things. So you can use it for project management, collaboration. But every decision in the company is these blog threads where they have comments that are threaded. People can embed videos or looms or YouTubes or maps or whatever is useful to move the conversation along. And we've been doing this so long that it's it's kind of like an organizational blockchain. So it's like a record of every single conversation and decision that's ever been made in the company. So how often do you come across something like we're looking at a product we haven't looked at in a few years? We're like, why is this rigid blue? Like, there's probably a good reason. And if you're,
Right.
you know, because companies have so much organizational, like goldfish going around and forgetting everything. Like they just reinvent the same problems over and over again, particularly in software where there's a
Yeah.
strong incentive to like rewrite things. You recreate bugs or you lose some of what worked about the old thing. So we're able to look back and say, okay, let's find exactly where it was decided that this widget would be blue.
Right.
And perfect. Like we can now tell, and we can use that wisdom and intelligence to iterate on the next.
So, right, it's visualizing work. I like how he describes they've created this organizational blockchain. They can just go back and figure out why did they do what they did. Saves a lot of time. Now, there's lots of ways of mapping this. One of my favorite tools for this is IOBEA, but there's lots of tools for sort of mapping how we work together. And in fact, I got a chance to interview astronaut Paul Richards last year, who had spent over 300 hours in space, and I asked him, well, what about remote collaboration from space? Like, what are the things that we have to think about when we're collaborating from space? And he said, well, actually, astronauts, we train to get the right information at the right place at the right time. And it was sort of like an aha moment, like, right, like we don't have to be in space. Like us regular people down here on Earth, this is the exact same thing that we can be doing with our teams, right? Training to have all the right information at the right place at the right time. So I want to, in our last few minutes together, I want to talk about culture, because this is the one thing that keeps coming up over and over and over again, is our company culture is suffering. And it's true, but I also believe that this deliberate, intentional way of working is a way of solidifying the culture again. One of my favorite quotes comes from Chase Warrington. He's the head of remote at Doist. And now this is the second time I've mentioned this job function, head of remote. And it is a new type of job function. You know, in the old days, we used to have the office managers. And now this is the head of remote is sort of the remote office manager, right? You sort of make sure that everything's going, that birthdays are celebrated, people have what they need. But what he says is team culture is primarily built by how you work together and not how you socialize together. And I really like that because we keep planning all these pizza parties and these quiz nights and yoga sessions, but really for some people, right, they hate those things. Right? I worked with a team that was 100% remote. They never talked to each other, and they liked it that way. So for them, going to these pizza parties would be like nails on a chalkboard. Right? So when I talked to Carlos Valdez de Pena, he says, we really need to understand the true team building comes from understanding why we come to work to begin with. Right? For some of us, it's all about solving challenging problems. That sounds like a nightmare to me. For me, it's all about who I work with. I don't even really care what I'm working on as long as I'm with the right people. And for others of us yet, it's just a job. And you're never going to motivate those three types of people with the same kind of thing. So when I interviewed Carlos, he said, he and his wife and he have been together for 25 years. He said, my wife and I, we can go to all the quiz nights and all the pizza parties in the world, and we will love each other more and more after every single time, but we should never hang wallpaper together. Right? He just illustrates that it's fun. You can have fun together, but it doesn't mean that you're going to work well together. So the true team building comes from understanding why people come to work. And during the workshops that I give, I always ask in one of the exercises, what is it that you need to feel connected on your team? I find the answers interesting. So this was just last week. What do you need to feel connected? Most people need trust and an acceptance and communication. One guy really needed laughing and jokes, and other people sharing the same goals. Here's another one. This one was from last year. You'll notice a theme, right? Transparency. I need empathy to feel connected. There's not even money on these lists, right? They don't need more money. There's not even vacations on this list, right? So I think when we start to think about company culture, we need to think more about how do we work together? And it's fine to have all the pizza parties, but it doesn't mean you're going to work well together. Connection happens when we pay attention to each other. And so the challenge in this hybrid way of working is finding new ways to pay attention to each other. One of the easiest places to start is with gratitude and showing appreciation. It turns out that everybody likes to be appreciated for a job well done. But the opposite is also true, that morale starts to decline when people don't feel appreciation. So it's in one of these situations where when we do nothing, something negative can happen. And back to Abe again, this is an email that he got from his manager saying, or from a colleague, just saying, hey, just a quick note to say thanks. And there's been a number of times on this project where Deb and I have said, oh, thank goodness for Abe. So not only did this make Abe's day, he actually printed it out and hung it on his wall, but he also sent it to all of his friends in one of our mutual friend channels, right? One email saying, thank goodness for Abe, went a really long way. So gratitude is a great place to start. And even in my workshops, what I do is I send every participant a pack of cards in the mail as an example to show how much joy and delight can be created by a simple act of just sending somebody something in the mail or just saying thank you for something. So to wrap up, we know that the future of work is flexible and it's also deliberate. And sadly, there's no one right way. I wish there were. I would have made that silver bullet formula and just made $1 million. But sadly, there's no one right way. What works for one team is not going to work for the other. And I think that's what makes this situation so difficult. But it's in everybody's best interest to make it work. Because when we get it right, we as individuals get the freedom to design our days and our lives around the things that matter most to us, and our companies get a more connected workforce that is not dependent on location. And so when we go into this flexible first way of working, you'll see a theme from the other talks also this morning. There needs to be an increased focus on autonomy and transparency and accountability, right? We have to close that loop. We need to have better documentation and information management. Right now, I think the statistics say that we spend 1 to 2 hours a day just looking for things, right? So we need to have the right information at the right place at the right time. An astronaut spending an hour looking for things is not going to go well. Right? We need to have more frequent feedback loops. That annual performance review never cut it when we work together in person, and it definitely doesn't cut it when we work in this new way. And of course, an increased focus on a sustainable work-life balance. So, if you go back to the office, I hope that you don't go backwards in time. And thank you very much for being here and paying attention before lunch. I know that is a tough time. Thank you.